The auction block in Mobile, Alabama, stank of sweat, tobacco, and fear. August 1853 had brought a heat so thick it seemed to crawl beneath the skin, settling into the lungs like wet cotton. The air shimmered above the wooden platform where human beings stood chained, their eyes cast downward, their futures measured in currency and cruelty. Thomas Whitmore stood among the crowd of planters and traders, his broad-brimmed hat doing little to shield his weathered face from the brutal sun. He owned 300 acres of cotton land in Clark County, worked by 47 souls he called property. He had come to Mobile for field hands, strong backs, young enough to last 20 years before breaking. The auctioneer's voice cut through the humid air like a preacher at a tent revival. Next lot, strong buck, 20 years old, all his teeth, no scars from whipping. Whitmore barely listened. He had heard these lies before. Every slave trader in the South claimed their merchandise was prime stock, untouched by disease or rebellion. The truth revealed itself only after money changed hands, when you discovered the consumption in their lungs or the hatred in their eyes. The morning dragged on. Whitmore purchased 2 men and a woman, paying fair market price, saying nothing. He was preparing to leave when he noticed the commotion near the rear of the platform. "Get that thing off the block!" someone shouted. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. This is a serious auction, not a circus. Whitmore pushed through the crowd. On the platform stood a child, or what appeared to be a child. The figure was no taller than a boy of 6, painfully thin, with arms like willow branches and legs that seemed incapable of supporting even that meager frame. But the face told a different story. The eyes were too old, too large, set deep in a skull that seemed ancient. Scars crisscrossed the exposed skin, old scars, the kind that spoke of years rather than months. The creature, Whitmore couldn't think of him as a boy, stood perfectly still, unblinking as the crowd jeered. "That's no field hand," a voice called out. "That's a freak show specimen." The trader, a rat-faced man named Jessup, whom Whitmore recognized from previous auctions, held up his hands defensively. Gentlemen, I admit this one's unusual, but he's strong enough." "House servant material, perhaps?" "House servant," a planter in a cream-colored suit laughed harshly. "That thing would frighten the children. Put it back in whatever hole you found it." Jessup's face reddened. "I'll take 7 cents for him, 7 cents. That's the price of a hammer. Someone must need. I'll take him." The words left Whitmore's mouth before he fully understood why he'd spoken. The crowd turned to stare. Whitmore stepped forward, reaching into his vest pocket for coins. He suddenly felt foolish for offering. Jessup's eyes lit with desperate gratitude. "Sold to Mr. Whitmore of Clark County. Sir, you won't regret—" "I already regret it," Whitmore muttered, but he handed over the 7 cents anyway. The creature, Benji, Jessup called him, though he admitted he didn't know if that was truly his name, was unchained and led down from the platform. He moved with an odd, shuffling gait, his oversized eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. He didn't look at Whitmore. He didn't look at anything, really. "Does he speak?" Whitmore asked. Jessup shrugged. "Never heard him. Don't think he can. Found him in a lot of runaways near Pensacola. No papers, no brand, nothing. Probably born defective." Whitmore studied the small figure. Defective, perhaps. But something in those ancient eyes suggested a different story, one that had been carved into flesh and bone until speech became unnecessary. The journey back to Clark County took 3 days. Whitmore traveled with his new purchases in a wagon, the slaves chained in the back, while he sat up front with his driver, a free black man named Moses, who had worked for the Whitmore family for 15 years. Moses kept glancing back at Benji with an expression Whitmore couldn't quite read. "Something wrong?" Whitmore finally asked on the second day. Moses was silent for a long moment. "That little one," he said quietly. He got old eyes, real old. He's probably seen hard times. Ain't about hard times, Mr. Whitmore. Moses's voice dropped lower. My grandmother, she was from the islands. She told stories about children born carrying the weight of those who came before. She said sometimes, when enough suffering gets pressed into one place, it changes the shape of things, makes them into something new. Whitmore frowned. That's superstition, Moses. Yes, sir, probably is. But Moses didn't look back at Benji again for the rest of the journey. They arrived at Whitmore Plantation on a Thursday evening as the sun bled red across the cotton fields. The slaves were returning from the fields, their songs drifting across the land like prayers that would never be answered. Whitmore's overseer, a thick-necked brute named Calhoun, came to inspect the new arrivals. Calhoun looked at the two men with approval, at the woman with casual appraisal, and at Benji with open disgust. What in God's name is that? New purchase, Whitmore said shortly. Find work for him. Work? Calhoun's laugh was ugly. Mr. Whitmore, that thing looks like it would break if I breathed on it hard. What kind of work? I don't care what kind, just keep him out of sight of the house. Mrs. Whitmore is delicate-natured. That night, in the slave quarters, the whispers began. The cabin assigned to Benji was cramped and dark, shared with 3 other men who worked the fields. They were suspicious at first, then openly hostile when they saw the small figure who would be taking up space and eating rations. An older man named Samuel spoke first. Boy, you understand English? Benji didn't respond. He sat in the corner, his 2 large eyes reflecting the dim light from the single candle. I asked you a question. Samuel's voice hardened. Still nothing. Leave him be, said another man, younger, called Marcus. Can't you see he ain't right? Probably simple in the head. But the third man, Thomas, no relation to the master, leaned forward, studying Benji's face. Ain't simple, he said slowly. Something else. Something worse. What you mean, worse? Thomas pointed at the scars on Benji's exposed arms. You see how old them marks are? And look at his hands. Them ain't child hands, them's working hands, worn down to bone. This ain't no child. This is something that's been alive a long time, just stuck in a child's shape. That's fool talk, Samuel said, but his voice lacked conviction. They left Benji alone after that, each man retreating to his own corner of the cabin. But none of them slept well. Throughout the night, they could feel those ancient eyes watching them in the darkness, never closing, never blinking. The next morning, Calhoun put Benji to work. The task was simple enough. Carry sacks of cotton from the weighing station to the wagon. The sacks weighed 60 pounds each, and even strong men needed both arms and all their strength to lift them. Calhoun expected the small figure to fail immediately, providing entertainment for the morning. Go on then, Calhoun said, gesturing at a sack. Let's see what 7 cents buys these days. Benji approached the sack. His thin arms reached down, and then he lifted it. Not struggled, not strained, lifted, as if the 60 pounds of densely packed cotton weighed no more than a child's doll. The men working nearby stopped. Calhoun's smile faded. Well, the overseer said after a moment, must have been a light sack. Try another. Benji carried the first sack to the wagon, set it down gently, and returned. He lifted the second sack just as easily. Then a third, a fourth. By the 10th sack, a crowd had gathered. By the 20th, men were crossing themselves and muttering prayers. Benji didn't slow, didn't tire, didn't show any sign of effort. His small body moved with mechanical precision, back and forth, lifting weights that should have crushed him. Calhoun's face had gone pale. Stop, he said hoarsely. That's enough. But Benji didn't stop. He kept working, kept lifting, as if the command meant nothing, as if nothing meant anything except the work itself. It wasn't until Calhoun physically stepped in front of him that Benji finally paused, those 2 large eyes fixed on some point beyond the overseer's shoulder. That night, Calhoun went to the main house and poured himself 3 fingers of Whitmore's bourbon without asking permission. We got a problem, he said. Whitmore looked up from his ledgers. What kind of problem? That little one you bought. The dwarf. He ain't natural, Mr. Whitmore. He lifted 60-pound sacks like they was feather pillows. Did it all day without breaking a sweat. The men are spooked. They're saying—" He stopped, took a long drink. "Saying what? That he's got the devil in him, or something worse." Whitmore set down his pen slowly. "That's ridiculous. He's just stronger than he looks." "No, sir." Calhoun's voice was firm. "I've seen strong men. This ain't that. This is something else. Something wrong." In the darkness beyond the house, in the cabin where Benji sat unmoving in his corner, the other slaves huddled together and spoke in whispers. "He got the strength of the dead," Thomas said quietly. "All the ones who died in chains, their power went somewhere, had to go somewhere. Maybe it went into him." "That's just stories," Samuel protested, but his voice shook. Marcus stared at the small figure in the corner. "If that's true," he said slowly, "then what happens when he decides to use it?" No one had an answer, and Benji, his ancient eyes reflecting the candlelight like mirrors, said nothing at all. Dr. Harrison Webb arrived at Whitmore Plantation on a Tuesday morning in early September, his medical bag clutched in one hand and his skepticism firmly intact. He had traveled from Montgomery at Thomas Whitmore's urgent request, expecting to find some case of unusual disease or perhaps a genetic abnormality worth documenting for the medical journals. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. "He's in the barn," Whitmore said, leading the doctor across the dusty yard. "I've had him working under observation for 2 weeks now. Doctor." "Webb, I'm not a superstitious man, but what this creature can do defies every law of nature I understand." Webb adjusted his spectacles, his expression one of professional patience. "Mr. Whitmore, I've examined countless cases of unusual human development. Dwarfism, gigantism, various muscular abnormalities. I'm certain there's a rational explanation." He stopped speaking when he saw Benji. The small figure stood in the center of the barn, hitched to a plow designed for a full-grown mule. The plow's blade was buried deep in hard-packed earth, and as Webb watched in stunned silence, Benji began to walk forward. The plow moved with him, cutting through soil that would have required 2 strong horses to break. "Dear God," Webb whispered. Calhoun stood nearby, his face a mask of barely concealed fear. "He's been at it since dawn, plowed 3 acres already, ain't even breathing hard." Webb approached slowly, as one might approach a wild animal. Up close, Benji was even more disturbing than from a distance. The body was that of a malnourished child, all jutting bones and paper-thin skin. But the muscles beneath that skin moved with an alien efficiency, cords of sinew that seemed to operate on principles Webb couldn't begin to understand. "Stop him," Webb commanded. "I need to examine him." Calhoun hesitated. "He don't always stop when you tell him to." "Then unhitch him from that plow." It took 3 men to remove the harness from Benji's small frame. Throughout the process, Benji remained perfectly still, his enormous eyes fixed on the middle distance, never acknowledging the hands that touched him or the voices that spoke around him. Webb led Benji into the barn's tack room, where he had set up a makeshift examination area. Whitmore and Calhoun followed, neither man willing to be left alone with the creature. "Remove his shirt," Webb instructed. When the rough cotton fabric was pulled away, all 3 men inhaled sharply. Benji's torso was a map of scars, some old and white, others more recent and still raised. But it wasn't the evidence of suffering that shocked them. It was the anatomical impossibility of what lay beneath. Webb placed his stethoscope against Benji's chest and immediately pulled back as if burned. "What is it?" Whitmore demanded. Webb's hands trembled as he repositioned the stethoscope, moving it across Benji's chest, his face growing paler with each placement. "His heart," he said hoarsely. "Dear God in heaven, his heart. What about it?" "It's beating in multiple rhythms. Not irregular, multiple distinct rhythms, as if," Webb struggled for words, "as if there are several hearts beating in synchronization within his chest cavity." "That's impossible," Whitmore said flatly. "Yes," Webb agreed, "it is impossible, and yet I'm hearing it with my own ears." He continued his examination with increasingly shaking hands. Benji's pulse was rapid yet stable, too stable, maintaining a perfect cadence that never varied. His temperature was elevated but not feverish. His lungs expanded and contracted with mechanical precision, drawing breath in perfect intervals that no human body should maintain unconsciously. Webb measured Benji's arms, his legs, his chest circumference. He tested the boy's reflexes, his vision, his response to pain. That last test proved the most disturbing. When Webb pricked Benji's finger with a lancet, the small body didn't flinch. Blood welled up, dark, thick blood that seemed to move sluggishly, as if reluctant to leave the body that contained it. "Does he ever speak?" Webb asked. "Never," Calhoun replied. "Don't think he can." Webb leaned close, looking into those two large eyes. "Can you understand me?" he asked gently. "If you can hear me, blink twice." Benji's eyes remained fixed, unblinking on some point beyond Webb's shoulder. But for just a moment, so brief that Webb almost missed it, something flickered in those ancient depths. Not understanding, not confusion. Something older and darker, something that recognized Webb's question and chose not to answer. Webb pulled back quickly, his heart hammering. "I need to take measurements, detailed measurements. I need to write to colleagues in New Orleans, in Boston. This is," he struggled for words, "this is beyond my understanding." Over the next 3 days, Webb conducted the most thorough examination of his career. He measured Benji's bone density and found it impossibly dense, like iron wrapped in flesh. He tested the boy's strength systematically, asking him to lift progressively heavier weights. Benji lifted them all without visible effort, stopping only when there were no heavier weights to lift. Webb documented everything in careful script, his medical training warring with what his senses told him was real. He wrote, "Subject exhibits strength disproportionate to body mass by a factor I cannot calculate. Conservative estimates suggest force output equivalent to 10 fully grown adult males. Cardiac function abnormal. Multiple rhythmic patterns detected, suggesting either severe defect or anatomical structure unknown to medical science. Subject does not vocalize, does not exhibit normal pain response, does not appear to require normal periods of rest or sleep." On the 4th day, Dr. Marcus Beauregard arrived from New Orleans. Beauregard was a specialist in anatomical abnormalities, a man who had studied the famous cases of Chang and Eng Bunker, the Siamese twins, and who had examined victims of elephantiasis from the Louisiana bayous. He came prepared to document a medical curiosity. He left questioning the nature of reality itself. Beauregard's examination was more invasive than Webb's. He drew blood, that strange, thick blood that seemed reluctant to flow. He measured lung capacity and found it impossibly large for such a small chest cavity. He tested muscle response and found reflexes that operated faster than human nerves should transmit signals. "This is no mere abnormality," Beauregard said on his second evening, sitting in Whitmore's study with a glass of brandy that he'd already refilled twice. "This is something else entirely. I've read accounts from the Caribbean, from Haiti specifically, of bodies animated by forces beyond our understanding. Voodoo practitioners speak of—" "Please," Whitmore interrupted, "I didn't bring you here for superstition." "Then you brought me here for nothing," Beauregard snapped, "because science has no answer for what that creature is. His heart beats like 5 men trapped inside a single chest. His blood moves wrong. His muscles operate on principles that shouldn't exist. Either he's a miracle of God or what?" Beauregard drained his glass. "Or he's something that should have stayed dead." That night in the slave quarters, the fear had turned to something darker. The men who shared Benji's cabin had stopped sleeping. They huddled together, speaking in whispers, their eyes constantly drawn to the small figure that sat unmoving in the corner. "He ain't eaten nothing in 4 days," Samuel said. "I been watching. He don't eat, he don't drink, he don't sleep." "How's he still moving then?" Marcus asked. Thomas's voice was hollow. "Because he ain't alive. Not the way we're alive. My grandmother told stories about this. About bodies that got filled up with all the suffering and anger of those who died. They walk around looking like people, but they ain't people anymore. They're vessels, containers for rage that got nowhere else to go." "That's just stories," Samuel protested weakly. "Then explain it," Thomas challenged. "Explain how something that small can pull a plow made for horses. Explain how he don't get tired, don't get hungry, don't feel pain. You can't, because there ain't no normal explanation." In the corner, Benji sat perfectly still, but if any of them had looked closely at his eyes in that moment, they might have seen something stirring in those ancient depths, something that heard their words and understood them better than they could possibly know. The next morning, Whitmore decided to test Benji's limits himself. He had the boy brought to the quarry at the edge of his property, where a massive limestone boulder sat half buried in the earth. The boulder had been there for decades, too large to move, too hard to break. "If he's as strong as you claim," Whitmore said to Calhoun, "have him move that." Calhoun paled. "Mr. Whitmore, that rock weighs—" "I know what it weighs. That's the point." A crowd gathered. Slaves from the fields, house servants, even Mrs. Whitmore watching from a distance with her parasol raised against the sun. Dr. Webb stood with his notebook ready, though his hands shook too badly to write clearly. Benji approached the boulder without hesitation. His small hands gripped the stone, fingers finding purchase in tiny cracks and crevices. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding sound that set teeth on edge, the boulder shifted. Someone screamed. It might have been Mrs. Whitmore. The boulder moved another inch, another. Benji's small body didn't strain, didn't show effort. He simply pulled, and the stone that had sat unmoved for 40 years began to slide from its earthen bed. "Stop him!" Webb shouted. "For God's sake, stop him before—" But Benji didn't stop. He pulled the boulder completely free, and then, as the crowd watched in horrified silence, he lifted one edge of it off the ground. Not high, perhaps 6 inches. But that was enough. That was impossible. The boulder dropped back to earth with a sound like thunder. Benji stood beside it, unchanged, unaffected, his ancient eyes fixed on nothing at all. Webb dropped his notebook. His carefully maintained scientific detachment crumbled. "That's not human," he whispered. "That can't be human." Whitmore's face had gone grey. "What is he then?" "I don't know. But I know this. Whatever is inside that body, it isn't bound by the laws that govern flesh and bone. It's something else, something that accumulated over time, compressed into that small frame until it became concentrated, powerful." Beauregard, who had witnessed the entire display, spoke quietly. "In my studies, I've read accounts from ship captains who transported slaves across the Middle Passage. They wrote of cargo holds where hundreds died in darkness, chained together, their suffering so intense it seemed to take on physical weight. Some captains claimed that at journey's end, after they'd thrown the dead overboard, the ships sat higher in the water than they should, as if the suffering itself had added measurable weight." He paused. What if that weight had to go somewhere? What if it accumulated in the survivors, passed down through generations until it found a vessel small enough to contain it all? "That's madness," Whitmore said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Beauregard gestured at Benji. "Look at him. Really look. That's not a boy who happens to be strong. That's every lash, every chain, every scream that had nowhere to go. It found him. Found a body that could hold it, and now it lives in there, compressed and concentrated, waiting. Waiting for what? No one answered. In the silence that followed, Benji turned his head slowly, those enormous eyes sweeping across the crowd. For just a moment, everyone felt the weight of that gaze, ancient, knowing, patient, so terribly patient. That night, Webb and Beauregard prepared to leave. Both men had filled notebooks with observations that neither could explain. Both knew their colleagues would dismiss their findings as fraud or fantasy. The evidence was undeniable, but the implications were unacceptable. "What will you do with him?" Webb asked Whitmore as they stood on the plantation's front porch. Whitmore stared out at the dark fields. "What can I do? He works. He doesn't rebel. By every legal measure, he's valuable property." "He's not property," Beauregard said quietly. "He's a reckoning that hasn't happened yet." After the doctors left, Whitmore went to his study and opened his ledger. On the page where he'd recorded the purchase of 4 slaves in Mobile, he found the entry for Benji, dwarf boy, unusual strength, 7 cents. 7 cents, the price of a broken tool. Whitmore picked up his pen, intending to add notes about Benji's capabilities and thus increase his assessed value. But his hand trembled and the ink made dark spots on the page. Finally, he set the pen down and closed the ledger. Some prices couldn't be calculated in currency. In the slave quarters, Thomas lay awake, listening to the sounds of the night. Somewhere in the darkness, Benji sat unmoving in his corner. Thomas thought about his grandmother's stories, about bodies that carried the weight of all who came before. He thought about his own parents, dead in a cotton field, their bodies worn to nothing by labor they never chose. He thought about rage that had nowhere to go, and he wondered what would happen when it finally found its way out. September gave way to October, and the cotton grew heavy on its stalks. The harvest season descended on Whitmore Plantation like a sentence passed down from a merciless judge. 16-hour days, backs bent beneath the Alabama sun, hands bleeding from the sharp edges of cotton bolls, and quotas that could never quite be met. Benji worked among them, silent and terrible. He picked cotton faster than any 3 men combined, his small fingers moving with mechanical precision, never slowing, never stopping. While others collapsed from exhaustion or snuck moments of rest when Calhoun's attention wandered elsewhere, Benji continued his rhythmic harvest. By the end of the first week, he had picked more cotton than the plantation's 5 strongest workers combined. Calhoun was delighted, Whitmore was troubled, and the slaves were terrified. "He don't cast no shadow right," a woman named Delilah whispered to her daughter as they worked the rows. "You watch him when the sun's overhead. His shadow falls wrong, like there's more of him than you can see." Her daughter, young Ruth, glanced toward where Benji worked 30 yards away. "Mama, don't talk about him. They say talking about him draws his attention." "Child, he don't pay attention to nothing. That's what makes him so fearsome. He ain't even here, not really. Just his body is here, doing what it was told to do forever ago." The whispers spread through the fields like wind through wheat. Each worker had their own theory, their own explanation for the impossible thing moving among them. Some said he was touched by God, made strong to bear witness to suffering. Others claimed he was cursed, a punishment sent to remind them of their place. But most agreed on one thing: Benji wasn't entirely human anymore, if he ever had been. Samuel, who shared Benji's cabin, had taken to sleeping outside despite the October chill. "Can't stay in there," he told anyone who would listen. "He sits in that corner all night, eyes open, not moving. Ain't natural. Man needs to sleep, needs to rest. That thing don't need nothing." Marcus had become obsessed with observing Benji, watching him with the intensity of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "I counted his breaths one night," he told Samuel. "Exactly 12 breaths per minute. Never changes. Not when he's working, not when he's resting. Always exactly 12. That ain't how breathing works. That's something else breathing through him." Thomas, the eldest of the 3, had stopped talking about Benji entirely. But those who saw his face when he looked at the small figure recognized the expression there. Not fear, but recognition. As if Thomas understood something the others didn't, and that understanding had settled into him like ice water in his veins. The incident with the snake came on a Thursday morning, when the dew still clung to the cotton plants, and the sun was just beginning its climb into the pale sky. A field hand named Jacob was reaching deep into a cotton plant when he felt the strike. Fangs sinking into his forearm, venom pumping into his bloodstream. He screamed and stumbled backward, clutching his arm as the timber rattlesnake uncoiled from where it had nested in the cool shade of the cotton plants. The snake was massive, nearly 6 feet long, its triangular head weaving back and forth as it prepared to strike again. Jacob fell to his knees, already feeling the venom's burn spreading through his arm toward his heart. Workers scattered, shouting for help, knowing that death from a timber rattler was agonizing and often inevitable. Benji walked forward. He moved with the same unhurried pace he always maintained, closing the distance between himself and the snake. The rattler coiled tighter, its tail buzzing a warning that could be heard across the field. Its mouth opened, fangs extended, ready to strike. Benji reached down and grabbed the snake behind its head. What happened next would be retold in whispers for generations. The snake thrashed with desperate violence, its powerful body coiling around Benji's thin arm, trying to crush the bones within. But Benji's grip never wavered. He held the snake at eye level, those ancient eyes studying the creature with something that might have been curiosity. The snake's thrashing slowed. Its body went rigid, and then, as the watching crowd gasped in horror and wonder, Benji squeezed. The sound was soft, a wet crunching sound like a rotten branch breaking. The snake's head collapsed in Benji's grip, bone and scale and venom sac rupturing together. When he opened his hand, what fell to the ground was no longer recognizable as a snake's head. Benji dropped the body and walked back to his cotton row. He began picking again, as if nothing had happened. Jacob survived. The snake had barely injected any venom before dying, but the story spread like wildfire. By evening, every slave on the plantation knew what Benji had done. By the next morning, even the white overseers had heard, though they dismissed it as exaggeration or outright fabrication. But those who had seen it knew better. They had seen the ancient thing in Benji's eyes as he studied that snake. They had seen the casual ease with which he destroyed a creature that could kill a grown man. And they understood, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that if Benji wanted to, he could crush any of them just as easily. Calhoun increased Benji's workload, seeing opportunity in the boy's impossible capabilities. He had Benji hauling timber from the woodlot, pulling a cart that normally required 2 mules. He set him to breaking rocks for a new foundation, watching with greedy satisfaction as Benji's small fists reduced stone to gravel. He even considered hiring Benji out to neighboring plantations, imagining the profit to be made from renting out such a valuable curiosity. Whitmore forbade it. "We don't know what he is," Whitmore told his overseer one evening, standing on the porch of the main house as darkness settled over the cotton fields. "We don't know what he's capable of, or what might happen if we push him too far." Calhoun laughed, the sound harsh and confident. "He's a slave, Mr. Whitmore, same as all the rest. Little different in how he looks, sure, but still just property. He does what he's told, same as they all do." "Does he?" Whitmore's voice was quiet. "Have you ever actually ordered him to do something and had him refuse?" Calhoun's laughter faded. "Well, no, but have you ever seen him acknowledge an order at all? Or does he simply work endlessly, as if the orders don't exist? As if we don't exist?" The overseer had no answer to that. In the silence, they could hear the evening songs rising from the slave quarters, mournful melodies that spoke of suffering and endurance, of faith that tomorrow might somehow be different from today. But from one cabin, there was no singing. Benji's cabin stood silent. Inside that cabin, Marcus had finally worked up the courage to speak directly to Benji. The small figure sat in his usual corner, motionless as always, those enormous eyes reflecting the candlelight like dark mirrors. "I know you can hear me," Marcus said quietly. Samuel and Thomas had gone to the evening gathering, leaving him alone with the thing that terrified them all. "Don't know if you can understand, but I think you can. I think you understand everything." Benji didn't move, didn't blink, gave no sign he'd heard. Marcus continued anyway. My daddy died in these fields, worked himself to death for a man who didn't even know his name. My mama died birthing my sister, and my sister died before she could walk, and now it's just me, working the same dirt they worked, for the same nothing they got." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it, if living like this is even living. But then I look at you, and I think maybe you got the answer. Maybe you ain't living at all. Maybe you're just continuing. Maybe that's all any of us can do, just continue, one day after another, until continuing becomes the only thing left." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, so quickly Marcus almost missed it, Benji's eyes shifted. They moved from their fixed point in the middle distance and focused directly on Marcus's face. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. In those eyes, he saw something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. He saw accumulated centuries of suffering, of bodies broken and spirits crushed, of lives reduced to labor until labor became existence itself. He saw rage that had compressed over generations, condensed and concentrated, until it became something solid, something that could wear flesh and move and work and wait. He saw himself and his father and all who had come before, looking back at him through eyes that were no longer entirely eyes at all. "Dear God," Marcus whispered, stumbling backward. "What are you?" Benji's gaze returned to the middle distance. The moment passed. But Marcus knew with absolute certainty that he had just been seen by something that understood him far better than he would ever understand it. He fled the cabin and didn't return until dawn, when Thomas and Samuel came back and he could lose himself in their presence, pretending that nothing had happened. But he knew, they all knew on some level they couldn't articulate or defend. They knew that Benji wasn't just strong, he was strength itself, distilled and embodied. He was every back that had bent beneath the lash, every hand that had bled in the cotton fields, every heart that had stopped from exhaustion, all of it compressed into one small body that should have broken under the weight, but instead had become something new. Something that couldn't break, something that couldn't stop, something that was still waiting. October deepened and the harvest continued. The cotton came in by the wagon load, picked and processed and prepared for market in Mobile. It was shaping up to be Whitmore's most profitable year yet, thanks in no small part to the impossible productivity of one small slave who cost 7 cents. But in the slave quarters, the songs grew quieter. The laughter became forced. Children who used to play in the evening now stayed close to their parents, casting nervous glances toward the cabin where the thing that looked like a boy sat unmoving in the darkness. And in the main house, Whitmore found himself standing at his window in the dead of night, looking out across his property with a growing sense of unease he couldn't name. Something was building. Something had been building for a very long time, compressed and concentrated, waiting for the right moment. The harvest was almost complete. The cotton would soon be sold. Winter would come, bringing its temporary respite from the fields. But Whitmore had a terrible feeling that this winter would be different, that something was ending or perhaps beginning, and that the price of 7 cents was about to come due with interest that had been accumulating since the first ship crossed the Middle Passage, its hold full of suffering that had to go somewhere. It had gone into Benji, all of it, every lash, every chain, every scream. And Benji never forgot, could never forget. Because forgetting was a mercy, and whatever Benji was, he existed beyond mercy's reach. November brought cold rain to Clark County, turning the cotton fields into muddy expanses that sucked at boots and made every step a labor. The harvest was nearly complete, just a few acres remaining in the far fields, where the cotton plants grew stubbornly in soil too poor to yield much profit. Whitmore stood in his study, reviewing the season's accounts. Despite the weather, despite everything, it had been his most successful year. The numbers in his ledger told a story of prosperity built on the backs of those who would never see its rewards. His eyes kept returning to one entry, Dwarf boy, unusual strength, 7 cents. The best investment he'd ever made by pure profit calculation. But increasingly, it felt like something else, like a debt that would soon come due. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Calhoun entered without waiting for permission, his face flushed with anger and something else, fear. "We got a problem, Mr. Whitmore." "What kind of problem?" "It's the little one, Benji." Calhoun's voice was tight. "He's changed." Whitmore set down his pen slowly. "Changed how?" "Come see for yourself." They walked through the rain to the far fields, where the remaining cotton awaited harvest. A group of overseers and slaves stood in a loose circle, their attention fixed on something at the field's edge. Benji stood perfectly still, rain streaming down his small frame, his eyes fixed on the plantation house in the distance, but it was his posture that sent ice through Whitmore's veins. For the first time since arriving at the plantation, Benji's body language had changed. He no longer stood with that passive, mechanical stillness. Now he stood like a man preparing for war. "How long has he been like this?" Whitmore asked quietly. "Since dawn," Calhoun replied. "Won't respond to orders, won't move, just stands there staring at your house like he's deciding something." "Get him back to work." "We tried. He don't move. Thomas tried talking to him, you know, the old one who shares his cabin, but Benji just kept staring." Whitmore approached cautiously, feeling the weight of every eye upon him. The slaves watched with an expression he'd never seen before on their faces, not fear of him, not even fear of Benji, something else, something that looked almost like anticipation. "Benji," Whitmore said firmly, using the voice that had commanded men and slaves for 20 years. "Back to work, now." Benji's eyes shifted, focusing on Whitmore's face. In those ancient depths, Whitmore saw something that made his blood run cold. Recognition, judgment, and beneath it all, and rage so vast and patient it seemed to have its own weight, its own gravity. Then Benji turned and walked back to the cotton rows. He began picking as if nothing had happened. But everyone who witnessed it knew something had changed. The machine had made a choice. The vessel had acknowledged the existence of those who commanded it, and in that acknowledgement was a promise of something to come. That night, Whitmore couldn't sleep. He sat in his study with a bottle of bourbon, watching the rain streak down the windows. Outside, the plantation lay dark and silent, but he could feel it. A tension in the air, like the pressure before a thunderstorm, building and building with nowhere to release. His wife found him there at 3 a.m, still awake, still staring into the darkness. "Thomas, you need to rest." "I made a mistake, Margaret." His voice was hoarse from disuse and whiskey. "I bought something I shouldn't have bought. It's just a slave, a peculiar one, certainly, but no." He cut her off, his voice sharp. "It's not a slave. I don't know what it is, but it's not that. Slaves resist or submit. They accept or rebel. That thing out there does neither. It simply exists, and I think it's been existing for a very long time, waiting." Waiting for what? Whitmore had no answer, but in his bones, he knew. Waiting for the moment when patience would end and accounting would begin. The incident came 3 days later, on a grey Thursday morning when the rain had finally stopped, but the cold remained, seeping into bones and making joints ache. Calhoun was in a foul mood, made worse by the bourbon he'd consumed the night before. He walked the rows with his whip coiled at his belt, looking for excuses to demonstrate his authority, to remind himself and everyone else who held power here. He found his excuse when a field hand named Benjamin, no relation to Benji, though the similarity in names was noted by some as ominous, stumbled and dropped his cotton sack, spilling its contents into the mud. "You clumsy fool!" Calhoun's voice carried across the field. "That's money in the mud, Mr. Whitmore's money." Benjamin scrambled to recover the cotton, his hands shaking. "Sorry, sir. I'm sorry, didn't mean to." The whip cracked across his back before he could finish. Benjamin cried out, curling protectively around himself as Calhoun raised the whip for another strike. "Maybe this'll teach you to mind your—" Calhoun stopped. His arm, raised high for the second lash, wouldn't move. He tried to bring it down, but it was as if the air itself had solidified around him, holding him frozen. Then he felt it. A hand on his wrist. Small fingers wrapped around his arm with a grip like iron, stopping the whip mid-swing. Benji stood beside him, those enormous eyes now focused with terrible intensity on Calhoun's face. "Let go of me," Calhoun said, his voice shaking. "Let go right now, or I'll—" Benji squeezed. Just a little. The sound of breaking bone was sharp and clear in the silent field. Calhoun screamed, dropping the whip as his wrist snapped like a dry twig. He fell to his knees, cradling his ruined arm, his face white with shock and pain. Benji released him and stepped back. For a moment, he looked down at the fallen overseer with those ancient eyes. Then he bent, picked up the cotton that Benjamin had spilled, and placed it carefully back into the sack. The field was absolutely silent. 50 workers stood frozen, watching, waiting. Calhoun, still on his knees, looked up at the small figure standing over him. "You're dead," he gasped through pain-clenched teeth. "You hear me? You're dead. They'll hang you for this. Benji walked away. Back to his row, back to his work, as if Calhoun no longer existed. As if the breaking of bones was simply another task completed, another weight lifted, another moment of patience rewarded. But everyone in that field understood what had just happened. The machine had made another choice. The vessel had taken an action unprompted, unordered. The accumulated suffering of generations had reached critical mass and begun to leak out, drop by drop. And once such leaking began, it never stopped until the container was empty. Whitmore was summoned immediately. He arrived at the field to find Calhoun being loaded into a wagon, his wrist already swelling to twice its normal size, his face grey with shock. The slaves had returned to work, but their movements were different now, purposeful, almost eager, as if the air itself had changed. "It was unprovoked," Calhoun insisted as the wagon prepared to carry him to the doctor in town. "I was disciplining a clumsy slave, and that thing attacked me. You have to deal with it, Mr. Whitmore. You have to show them all that such behavior won't be tolerated." Whitmore looked across the field to where Benji worked, unchanged, unaffected. "Did he try to hurt you further after you fell?" "What? No, but did he threaten you? Show any aggression after the initial contact?" Calhoun's face reddened. "He broke my arm. What more aggression do you need?" But Whitmore wasn't listening anymore. He was remembering Dr. Webb's words. Whatever is inside that body isn't bound by the laws that govern flesh and bone. It's something that accumulated over time, compressed into that small frame until it became concentrated. And Dr. Beauregard's warning, he's not property. He's a reckoning that hasn't happened yet. The wagon carried Calhoun away. Whitmore remained in the field, watching Benji work, trying to calculate the cost of what was coming. You didn't need to be a genius to see it. The pattern was clear. Benji had been passive for months, doing whatever was asked, existing as a tool, a machine, a piece of property worth 7 cents. But property didn't make decisions. Machines didn't protect the weak, and no amount of compression could contain infinite weight forever. Something was breaking. Or perhaps something had finally broken completely, and what remained was no longer constrained by the rules that had held it in place. That night, the slave quarters erupted into feverish discussion. For the first time in memory, voices were raised above whispers. The fear that had kept them subdued was being replaced by something else. Not hope exactly, but a kind of terrible anticipation. "Did you see his face when he grabbed Calhoun?" Ruth asked her mother, Delilah. "It didn't change at all, like he was picking cotton or breaking rocks, just another task." "That's what makes it so fearsome," Thomas said. He sat in the center of the cabin, surrounded by younger workers who had come seeking his wisdom, his understanding of things beyond the everyday. He ain't angry, ain't vengeful. He's just doing what he was made to do, same as always. Only now, what he was made to do is starting to show itself clear. "And what's that?" someone asked. Thomas's voice was quiet but carried to every ear. "To break chains, not by fighting, not by running, just by existing until existence itself becomes unbearable for those who try to contain it. He's every back that bent until it broke, every hand that bled until it couldn't hold no more, every heart that beat until it stopped, all of that concentrated down and pressed tight. And now the pressure's looking for release." "You make him sound like some kind of weapon," Samuel said. "He is a weapon. We all are. Suffering makes weapons out of people, either weapons turned against ourselves or against those who cause the suffering. Benji's just the purest form. Nothing but the weapon, with nothing human left to hold it back." In his corner, Benji sat motionless. But if anyone had been watching closely, they might have seen his fingers flex once, slowly, as if testing their strength, as if remembering the feel of bone breaking beneath them. Whitmore sent for more doctors, more experts. He wrote urgent letters to colleagues in Mobile and Montgomery, describing the situation in terms that wouldn't sound insane. But even as he wrote, he knew it was useless. No doctor could diagnose what Benji was. No expert could explain the inexplicable. He was trapped. He couldn't sell Benji. Who would buy such a thing? He couldn't kill him. The law was clear on the wanton destruction of valuable property, and besides, Whitmore had a terrible suspicion that killing Benji might prove more difficult than it should be, and he couldn't set him free, couldn't simply release such a force into the world. So he waited, maintaining the illusion of control while the walls closed in around him. The second incident came on a Sunday, traditionally a day of rest when slaves were allowed to tend their own small gardens, repair their clothes, gather for worship. Whitmore had always permitted this, seeing it as a way to maintain productivity by allowing brief respite from the endless labor. This Sunday, as the slaves gathered near the old oak tree where they held services, Benji appeared among them. It was the first time he had voluntarily joined any gathering. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his small frame almost lost among the taller bodies, but his presence was felt by everyone. The preacher, an elderly man named Moses who had led services for 30 years, faltered in his sermon. "Brother," Moses said gently, "you're welcome here. All God's children are welcome." Benji didn't respond. He simply stood, those ancient eyes now focused on Moses with an intensity that made the old preacher's voice shake. Moses continued, his sermon taking on new urgency. He spoke of deliverance, of Moses leading his people from Egypt, of chains breaking and freedom promised. The words tumbled out faster, louder, as if he could somehow reach the thing standing before him, could somehow speak to whatever lived behind those terrible eyes. "The Lord sees our suffering." Moses' voice rose. "He knows every tear, every wound, every injustice, and in his time, in his way, he will deliver us. We must have faith. We must believe." Benji took a step forward, then another. The crowd parted before him like water, no one willing to stand in his path. He walked until he stood directly in front of Moses, looking up at the elderly preacher. "Child," Moses whispered, all his bravado gone. "What do you want?" For the first time since arriving at Whitmore Plantation, since being bought for 7 cents in a mobile auction house, Benji spoke. The sound that emerged from his throat was wrong. It was too deep for such a small body, too layered, as if multiple voices were speaking in perfect unison. The words were barely recognizable as English, distorted by whatever mechanism produced them. "No. More. Waiting." The crowd gasped. Moses stumbled backward, crossing himself repeatedly. Benji turned and walked away, back toward the fields, leaving absolute silence in his wake. "Dear God," someone whispered. "It can talk. That thing can talk." But Thomas, who had been standing nearby, shook his head slowly. That wasn't talking. That was something else. That was every voice that got silenced, all speaking together. That was every word that never got said, finally finding a way out. "Ooh, what do we do?" Ruth asked, her voice small and frightened. Thomas looked toward where Benji had disappeared into the gathering darkness. "Nothing we can do. Just wait. Same as always. Wait and see what happens when patience finally runs out." In the main house, Whitmore sat alone in his study, the bourbon bottle empty beside him. He hadn't heard what happened at the slave gathering. He didn't need to. He could feel it, that building pressure, that approaching storm. He thought about selling the plantation, moving north, starting over somewhere Benji couldn't follow. But he knew, with the certainty of a man who had finally glimpsed the true cost of his prosperity, that there was no escaping what was coming. He had bought something for 7 cents, something that contained more than could be measured, more than could be controlled. And now, after months of patience, after bearing the unbearable, that something had spoken. No more waiting. The harvest was complete. The cotton was sold. Winter was coming, and with it the reckoning. December came to Clark County with unusual warmth, as if winter itself had decided to hold its breath. The cotton fields lay fallow, the work reduced to maintenance and preparation for the coming planting season. It should have been a time of relative peace, when the relentless pressure of harvest gave way to the slower rhythms of winter labor. Instead, the plantation felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Whitmore hired 3 new overseers to replace Calhoun, who had left for Mobile and refused to return. "That thing broke my wrist like it was nothing," he told anyone who would listen, and the look in its eyes. There wasn't nothing human in there, nothing that could be reasoned with or controlled. The new overseers were younger, harder men who prided themselves on maintaining discipline through fear. They carried rifles in addition to whips, and they made it clear from their first day that the incident with Calhoun would not be repeated. "Don't matter how strong that dwarf is," the lead overseer, a man named Pike, announced to the assembled slaves. "Bullet moves faster than muscle. Any of you step out of line, you'll learn that lesson permanent." Benji stood among the crowd, his ancient eyes studying Pike with that same terrible patience. Pike noticed the attention and sneered. "That includes you, runt. I heard the stories. Impressive party tricks, breaking rocks and such, but you're still just property, same as all the rest. You remember that?" Benji said nothing, but those who stood near him swore they felt the temperature drop, as if something cold and vast had briefly pressed close to the world of the living. The days passed with increasing tension. The slaves worked in near silence, the usual songs and conversations muted by a pervasive sense of anticipation. Everyone was waiting for something, though no one could say exactly what. Thomas, whose wisdom had become sought after by many of the younger workers, spoke one evening to a group gathered in his cabin. Benji sat in his usual corner, motionless as always, but now his presence felt different, not passive but active, a weight pressing down on reality itself. "My grandmother told me about the Middle Passage," Thomas said quietly, "about the ships that brought our ancestors across the ocean. She said tens of thousands died in those holds, chained in darkness, suffocating on their own suffering, and she said all that suffering had to go somewhere, couldn't just disappear. Energy don't vanish. It changes form, moves to somewhere else." "You think Benji's carrying all that?" Marcus asked. "All the suffering from those ships?" "I think Benji's carrying more than that. I think he's carrying every bit of pain and rage and grief that's had nowhere to go since the first chain was locked around the first ankle. All of it compressed down into one small body until that body became something new. Something that can't be broken because it's already made of broken things. Then what happens when—" Marcus stopped, unable to finish the question. Thomas finished it for him. "When it finally breaks free, when all that compressed suffering finds release." He shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but I know it won't be gentle. Suffering never is." In the corner, Benji's fingers twitched. Once, twice, as if counting down to something inevitable. The catalyst came on December 15th, on a night when the moon hung full and bright above the plantation, casting silver light across the fields and buildings. The new overseers had been drinking in the barn, celebrating Pike's birthday with whiskey smuggled from Mobile. They were drunk when they decided to have some sport with the slaves. Pike and his companions, two brothers named Earl and Jim Dawson, made their way to the slave quarters around midnight, their laughter loud and cruel in the quiet night. They pounded on cabin doors, rousing people from sleep, demanding entertainment. "Come on out!" Pike shouted. "Let's see some dancing, some singing. Earn your keep, you lazy." He used words that don't need repeating. Words that had been used 10,000 times before in 10,000 similar situations by men who believed that power gave them the right to diminish others. The slaves emerged slowly, reluctantly, knowing that resistance would only make things worse. They formed a circle in the open space between cabins while Pike and the Dawsons watched, their rifles held casually but ready. "Dance," Pike commanded, "like you do on Sundays. Let's see it." No one moved. The moonlight cast long shadows, and in those shadows fear wrestled with something else, something that had been building for months, compressed and concentrated, waiting for the right moment. "I said dance!" Pike's voice rose, tinged now with anger. He raised his rifle, pointing it at an elderly woman named Sarah. "Or maybe I need to provide some motivation." Benji stepped into the circle. He moved without sound, without warning, simply materializing from the shadows, as if he'd been waiting there all along. In the moonlight, his small frame cast an enormous shadow that seemed to writhe and twist with a life of its own. Pike lowered his rifle, fixing Benji with a contemptuous stare. "Well, look at this, the famous strong man. You want to dance? Runt? Show us what 7 cents can buy?" Benji didn't speak. He simply stood there, his enormous eyes reflecting the moonlight like dark mirrors. But something had changed. The patient waiting was over. The compression had reached its limit. What happened next would be debated and retold for generations, the details growing more fantastical with each telling. But those who were there, who witnessed it firsthand, all agreed on the essential truth of what they saw. Benji moved. He crossed the distance to Pike faster than eyes could follow, his small body becoming a blur of motion. Pike had time to raise his rifle halfway before Benji's hand closed around the barrel. The metal crumpled like paper. Pike screamed and pulled the trigger. The gun exploded, shards of metal and wood flying in all directions. But Benji was untouched. He stood holding the ruined weapon, his head tilted slightly, as if considering what to do next. Earl and Jim raised their own rifles, but Benji was already moving. He threw the destroyed gun with casual strength, and it struck Earl in the chest like a cannonball, sending him flying backward into the wall of the nearest cabin. The wood splintered with the impact. Jim's rifle discharged, the bullet passing so close to Benji's head that several witnesses swore they saw it part his hair. But Benji didn't flinch. He reached Jim in 3 quick steps and grabbed the rifle with both hands. He bent it, not broke it, bent it as one might bend a willow branch, until the barrel pointed back toward the stock in a perfect U-shape. Then he set it gently at Jim's feet and waited. Jim dropped to his knees, his hands raised in surrender, his face white with terror. Earl wasn't moving, unconscious or dead against the cabin wall, and Pike stood frozen, staring at the small figure that had just destroyed 3 armed men without breaking a sweat. "What are you?" Pike whispered. Benji's mouth opened. That same wrong sound emerged, that layered voice speaking with the accumulated weight of generations. "No more chains." His small hand reached out and grabbed Pike's arm. Not squeezing, not crushing, simply holding. But Pike felt it, the strength contained in that grip, the power that could tear him apart as easily as breath. "Please," Pike begged. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean. Please don't." Benji released him. Pike fell to his hands and knees, gasping, his arm already bruising where those small fingers had gripped him. Then Benji turned to the assembled slaves, and for the first time since arriving at Whitmore Plantation, his expression changed. Something that might have been recognition flickered across his face, something that might have been understanding. He walked to the cabin where the chains were kept, the heavy iron chains used to restrain those who ran or fought back. The door was locked with a padlock the size of a man's fist. Benji pulled the door off its hinges. Inside were dozens of chains, rusted with age and blood, each one a testament to suffering contained and controlled. Benji gathered them in his small arms, carrying more weight than 3 men could lift, and walked to the center of the gathering. He set them down gently, then one by one he broke them. The sound was incredible, metal snapping like dry twigs, links separating, shackles splitting. Benji worked methodically, without hurry, breaking every chain he'd gathered. And as he worked, something extraordinary happened. The slaves began to sing. It started with one voice, Moses, the old preacher, singing a spiritual about freedom and deliverance. Then others joined, their voices rising in the night air, harmonizing and building until the entire plantation seemed to vibrate with sound. Benji continued breaking chains, and the singing grew louder, more intense, more powerful. It was as if every voice that had been silenced, every song that had been suppressed, was finally finding expression through these people in this moment, witnessing the impossible. In the main house, Whitmore woke to the sound. He stumbled to his window and looked out across his property. What he saw made his blood run cold. The slave quarters were illuminated by moonlight and lanterns, and in the center of it all stood Benji, surrounded by broken chains, while dozens of voices sang songs of freedom. Pike and the Dawson brothers were huddled at the edge of the gathering, their weapons destroyed, their authority shattered. And behind Benji, his shadow stretched impossibly long and dark, seeming to contain shapes within shapes, figures upon figures, all the accumulated suffering finally finding form and substance. "It's over," Whitmore whispered to himself. "God help us all, it's over." His wife appeared beside him, her face pale in the lamplight. "Thomas, what's happening? What's that sound?" "The reckoning," he replied simply. "The price coming due." Benji finished breaking the last chain. The singing reached a crescendo and then faded, leaving an expectant silence. Every eye was on the small figure standing amid the ruins of their bondage. Thomas stepped forward, his elderly frame trembling but his voice steady. "What do you want us to do?" he asked. Benji turned those ancient eyes on him. When he spoke, his voice was clearer now, as if he was remembering how language worked, how words could convey meaning beyond brute force. "Choose," he said. The single word seemed to echo, carrying layers of implication. "Choose. What comes next?" "You mean run? Escape?" someone asked. Benji shook his head slowly. "More than escape. Choose who you are, not what they made you." Understanding rippled through the crowd. It wasn't just about physical freedom, it was about reclaiming something that had been stolen: identity, autonomy, the right to exist as whole human beings rather than fragments broken and reassembled to serve others' purposes. Samuel spoke up, his voice shaking. "But if we choose freedom, they'll hunt us down. They'll kill us all. You know that." Benji's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. He reached down and picked up a broken chain link, holding it in his small palm. Then he closed his fist. When he opened it again, the metal had been compressed into a ball so dense it seemed to warp the air around it. He held it out for all to see. "Suffering makes weapons," he said, the words coming easier now, as if speaking was becoming less foreign to whatever lived inside him. "You are already weapons." "I am just the proof." Delilah stepped forward, her daughter Ruth clinging to her side. "If we choose freedom, will you protect us? Will you fight for us?" Benji was silent for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "I am not your savior. I am your reminder. You already have what you need. I just show It exists. Then what are you? Ruth asked, her young voice clear in the night air. Benji looked at her, and for a moment something almost gentle flickered in those ancient eyes. I am all of you. Everything taken, everything crushed, everything that refused to disappear. I am what happens when suffering becomes solid. He set the compressed metal ball on the ground. Choose, he said again, before dawn. Then he walked away, back toward the fields, leaving the slaves to decide their fate. Behind him, the broken chains lay scattered like offerings, like promises, like threats. The gathering dissolved slowly, people returning to their cabins in groups, speaking in urgent whispers. Pike and the Dawsons fled toward the main house, their pride destroyed, their weapons useless. The moon continued its journey across the sky, marking time in silver increments. And in the slave quarters, a choice was being made. Not by everyone. Some would choose to stay, too afraid or too broken to risk the unknown. But others, the ones who had somehow preserved a core of self beneath the layers of suffering, those ones began to prepare. They gathered food, supplies, whatever they could carry. They said goodbye to those too old or too young or too frightened to join them. And as the night deepened toward dawn, they made ready to become something they had never been allowed to be: free. In the fields, Benji stood amid the cotton stalks, his small frame motionless, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun would soon rise. Around him, his shadow stretched in impossible directions, as if it couldn't decide which way to fall, as if it contained too much darkness to be constrained by simple geometry. He had done what he was made to do, broken chains, shown them the weapon they already were, reminded them that suffering, when compressed and concentrated, could become strength. The rest was up to them, but he knew, with the certainty of something that had witnessed generations of pain, that choice was just the beginning. Freedom wasn't given. It was taken, piece by piece, with all the cost that implied. And when morning came, when Whitmore sent men to restore order, when the consequences of this night began to manifest, Benji would be ready, because he was patience given form. He was suffering made solid. He was the weight of 10,000 lives compressed into one small body, and he was done waiting. Dawn broke over Whitmore Plantation like a wound opening, the sky bleeding red and orange across the horizon. In the grey light before full sunrise, Thomas Whitmore stood on his porch and surveyed the destruction of his carefully ordered world. The slave quarters were nearly empty. Of his 47 slaves, only 12 remained. The elderly, the infirm, and a handful too frightened to risk the unknown. The rest had vanished during the night, taking what they could carry and leaving behind everything that had defined them as property. Pike and the Dawson brothers sat on the porch steps, their faces still pale from the previous night's encounter. Earl's ribs were broken from his impact with the cabin wall. Jim couldn't stop his hands from shaking. And Pike's arm bore the distinct imprint of small fingers, bruised dark purple, where Benji had gripped him. "We need to send for the militia," Pike said for the third time that morning. "Get dogs, get trackers, round them up before they get too far." Whitmore didn't respond. He was looking at the broken chains scattered across the open space between cabins, gleaming in the early light like accusations rendered in iron. "Mr. Whitmore?" Pike pressed. "Sir, we need to act quickly. Every hour we wait, they get farther." "And the boy," Whitmore interrupted, his voice hollow. "The one who did this? What do we do about him?" Pike's face went pale. We could shoot him. From a distance, maybe." "You couldn't hit him from 3 feet away with a rifle," Whitmore said flatly. "What makes you think distance would help?" The truth hung unspoken between them. Benji had become untouchable, not through speed or cunning, but through something far more fundamental. He had become the physical manifestation of a debt that couldn't be paid, a bill that had come due after generations of being deferred. Whitmore's wife appeared at the door, her face drawn. Thomas, Mr. Patterson is here from the neighboring property. He says his slaves are talking about what happened last night. He wants to know what you're going to do. What could he do? Whitmore thought bitterly. He had bought something for 7 cents, thinking it was a bargain. But some prices aren't calculated in currency. Some debts are paid in consequences. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the fields. One of the remaining slaves, a boy of perhaps 14 named Joshua, came running toward the house, his face twisted with terror. "Mr. Whitmore! Mr. Whitmore! He's coming! The little one, he's coming!" Everyone turned to look. Sure enough, a small figure was walking across the fallow cotton fields, moving with that same unhurried pace Benji had always maintained. But something was different. The air around him seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from sun-baked earth. And his shadow, even in the uncertain dawn light, stretched wrong, too long, too dark, too full of shapes that shouldn't exist in a simple shadow. Pike reached for a rifle that was no longer there, remembered it had been destroyed, and instead drew his pistol with shaking hands. "Stay back," he said, though whether he was talking to Benji or warning the others, no one could say. Benji crossed the distance between field and house without hurry. He climbed the porch steps, one at a time, his small feet making no sound on the wood. When he reached the top, he stood before Whitmore, his enormous eyes meeting the planter's gaze directly for the first time. "They're gone," Benji said, his voice clearer now, as if he'd been practicing speech throughout the night. "Beyond your reach." "You helped them escape," Whitmore said. It wasn't a question. "No, I reminded them what they already were. They did the rest." Pike raised his pistol, the barrel trembling as he aimed at Benji's head. "Mr. Whitmore, let me put it down," Whitmore said quietly. "You'll just embarrass yourself again." Pike hesitated, then lowered the weapon, his face flushed with shame and fear. Whitmore studied the small figure before him. In the growing light, he could see the scars more clearly now, decades worth of them, layered like sediment, telling a story of suffering that should have killed any normal child. But Benji had never been normal, had never been just a child. "What are you?" Whitmore asked, the same question Pike had asked the night before. "Really, what are you?" Benji was silent for a long moment, as if considering how to put something complex into words that humans could understand. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of accumulated centuries. "I am the middle passage. Every ship that crossed, every body that died in chains, every scream that had nowhere to go." He paused. "Suffering doesn't disappear, Mr. Whitmore. It accumulates, compresses, waits. For what? For a vessel, for a body small enough and broken enough to contain it all." Benji's eyes seemed to look through Whitmore, seeing something beyond him. "I was born to slaves who were born to slaves. Each generation passed down their pain until there was too much for one changed body. What a body until could be." "You're saying you're some kind of repository for all the suffering of your people? Not just my people, all people, everyone who was ever broken and told they were nothing. I am what happens when nothing refuses to stay nothing." Whitmore felt something crack inside his chest. "Then what do you want? Revenge? To kill us all?" Benji shook his head slowly. "Revenge is human. I am beyond human. I don't want anything. I simply am a reminder, a weight on your conscience made flesh." "Then why break the chains? Why help them escape?" "Because chains are temporary. Fear is temporary. But the knowledge that they were strong enough To break free? Benji's expression didn't change, but something in his voice shifted. That stays, that becomes part of gave them nothing they didn't already have. I just showed them it existed. Pike found his courage again. You're just a slave, he said, his voice gaining strength. A freak of nature maybe, but still just property. You'll be caught, sold, or killed. This doesn't change anything. Benji turned those ancient eyes on Pike. You're right. I am just a slave, just property, worth 7 cents. He paused. But how is your fear worth? How much to sleep without wondering if your weapons will work, if your walls will hold, if the people you've broken will stay broken? Pike had no answer. None of them did. Benji turned back to Whitmore. I'm leaving. You can try to stop me, but we both know how that ends. Where will you go? Everywhere. Nowhere. I will be somewhere. I'm needs where to be reminded that suffering can become strength. Whitmore thought about trying to stop him, thought about sending for help, for militia, for anyone who might contain this impossible thing. But he knew it was futile. Benji had been contained his entire existence, compressed and constrained, and now that compression was ending. You couldn't put that back in a bottle any more than you could uncook an egg. Will they be safe? Whitmore asked quietly. The ones who left? Safer than they were. The rest is up to them. I am not their savior, just their reminder. Benji descended the porch steps and began walking toward the road that led away from the plantation. But before he disappeared from view, he stopped and turned back. Mr. Whitmore, you bought me for 7 cents. You thought you were getting cheap labor, but every purchase, every bargain has consequences. Cost. His voice became clearer, stronger. You didn't buy a slave. You bought proof that no amount of suffering can be contained forever. Proof that what you break doesn't disappear, it transforms. Into what? Into me, into them, into everyone who learned that being broken doesn't mean being defeated. Benji's shadow stretched across the yard, impossibly long and dark. 7 cents, the price of a broken tool. But broken tools can still cut. Then he was gone, his small figure disappearing down the road in the full light of morning. Behind him, the plantation lay in ruins, not physical ruins, but something deeper. The machinery of bondage had been exposed as breakable. The illusion of absolute control had been shattered. Whitmore stood on his porch for a long time after Benji vanished from sight. Around him, his remaining slaves went about their morning tasks with new awareness in their eyes. The neighboring planters would come soon, demanding explanations, threatening consequences. The militia would eventually be called, but Whitmore knew none of it would matter. The damage was done. Not damage to his property or his profits, though those losses were real enough. The real damage was to the fundamental assumption that had made slavery possible, that people could be reduced to things, that suffering could be inflicted without cost, that 7 cents could buy more than just 7 cents worth of labor. Benji had proven otherwise. He was the bill come due, the hidden cost revealed, the proof that nothing broken ever truly disappeared. It simply transformed into something else, something patient, something powerful, something that could break chains as easily as breathing. In the days that followed, stories spread throughout Clark County and beyond. Stories of a dwarf boy with the strength of 10 men. Stories of broken chains and midnight escapes. Stories that grew more elaborate with each telling, mixing fact and legend until no one could separate truth from myth. Some said Benji was seen in Mississippi, helping slaves escape through the Underground Railroad. Others claimed he appeared in South Carolina, breaking up slave auctions with his impossible strength. Still others swore he was in Louisiana, in Georgia, in Virginia, wherever suffering needed a reminder that it could become strength. Dr. Webb and Dr. Beauregard, when questioned later, could only shake their heads. Their careful medical documentation proved nothing except that the impossible sometimes became real. Their notes described a body that operated on principles beyond science, animated by forces that medical texts had no names for. He wasn't human, Webb would say in later years, when the war had ended and such topics could be discussed more freely. Or rather, he was too human. He was everything human suffering could become when compressed and concentrated. A living reminder that no atrocity ever truly disappears. It simply waits for the right vessel to give it form. Pike and the Dawson brothers left Clark County within a month, unable to sleep, unable to feel safe, the memory of Benji's grip still burning on their skin. Pike would wake screaming in the night, feeling small fingers wrapping around his arm, hearing that layered voice saying, "No more chains." He died young, at 43, of what his doctor called heart failure. But his family knew better. He had died of fear that never left, of a debt that couldn't be paid, of the knowledge that he had faced something beyond his understanding and barely survived the encounter. Whitmore never recovered his escaped slaves. Some were recaptured elsewhere, returned to bondage in other states, but most vanished completely, absorbed into free communities in the North, or lost in the vast anonymity of the war that would soon reshape the nation. The plantation itself declined rapidly. Other planters were reluctant to sell slaves to Whitmore, fearing their property might be infected by whatever had transformed Benji. Workers refused to come, spreading stories about the place where chains broke themselves and small children had the strength of demons. By 1857, Whitmore had sold most of his land. By 1859, he had sold the rest and moved to Mobile, where he died in 1862, not from injury or illness, but from what his doctor described as failure of will. He simply stopped eating, stopped caring, as if the weight of what he'd purchased for 7 cents had finally crushed him completely. The plantation buildings stood empty for years. Locals avoided them, claiming they could hear sounds in the night, the rattle of chains, the crack of breaking iron, and sometimes, very faintly, the voice of something small and ancient saying, "Choose, choose, choose." In 1878, during a thunderstorm, the barn collapsed. When workers came to clear the debris, they found something strange in the ruins. The master's cane, the one Whitmore had carried every day of his adult life, lay snapped cleanly in two. But more disturbing were the marks around it. Small handprints pressed into the wood so deeply they seemed burned rather than carved. The main house burned in 1882, cause unknown. Nothing of value was recovered. Local stories claimed that on the night it burned, witnesses saw a small figure standing in the fields, watching the flames with eyes that reflected light in impossible ways. But these were just stories, just legends, just the kind of tales people tell to explain the inexplicable. The truth was simpler and more terrible. On a day in August 1853, a man named Thomas Whitmore paid 7 cents for a boy called Benji. He thought he was buying cheap labor. He thought he was getting a bargain. What he actually purchased was proof that suffering accumulates, that broken things transform, and that every debt eventually comes due. Benji existed. His strength was real. His words were spoken. His actions changed lives. But more importantly, he changed what people believed was possible. He proved that chains could be broken not just physically, but conceptually, that the machinery of bondage could be exposed as fundamentally breakable. Some say he's still out there, appearing wherever suffering becomes concentrated enough to need a reminder. A small figure with ancient eyes, carrying the accumulated weight of all who were ever broken and refused to stay broken. Science cannot explain him, history can barely acknowledge him, but those who need him most know his truth. Suffering doesn't disappear, it transforms, it accumulates, it waits. And when the weight becomes too much for any normal body to bear, it finds a vessel strong enough to contain it all. 7 cents. The price of a broken tool, but broken tools can still cut. And some things, once broken, refuse to be mended. They become something new instead, something patient, something powerful, something that remembers every chain, every lash, every scream that had nowhere to go. And when the world needs reminding that suffering can become strength, when the weight of accumulated pain becomes unbearable, that's when the small figure appears. That's when Benji walks again. In the ruins of Whitmore Plantation, they say that during storms, you can still hear the pounding, like small fists demanding to be freed, like compressed suffering seeking release, like debts demanding payment. They bought him for 7 cents. What they unleashed had no price. And it's still out there, waiting, always waiting, for the next person who thinks suffering can be contained, for the next chain that needs breaking, for the next reminder that what we break doesn't disappear, it transforms, and transformation, once begun, can never truly be undone.